Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for attending the Future of Safety Science webinar series. My name is Dennis Avalar, and I am a digital content developer for Underwriters Laboratories. Before we begin, we would like to go over a few quick housekeeping items. First, while we are broadcasting on GoToWebinar, we are also playing live on Kahoot. For users who would like to be part of our interactive game during today's webinar, please log on to kahoot.it or use the Kahoot app, where you will be prompted to enter a 7-digit game PIN, seen here on the bottom right-hand side of your screen. Next, all participants are encouraged to enter any questions that they have into the questions box on their GoToWebinar control panel. We will be monitoring the questions box and asking questions to our panelists. Next, all participants will be muted during today's presentation. And finally, this presentation will be recorded for future use, which we plan on posting as a video on ul.org, the Underwriters Laboratories website. With that, I would like to introduce everyone to Dr. Kelly Keena, Director of Education and Outreach for Underwriters Laboratories. Kelly?
Awesome. Thanks, Dennis. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome or welcome back to our Future of Safety Science series, where we are asking the big questions about how our world is engineered to keep us safe. Each month, we have conversations with our experts in safety and sustainability, including the opportunity to drill down into specific inquiries and research, and to describe the process and impacts of global standards. As Dennis said, we are using Kahoot throughout today's webinar. If you've never done this, it's actually very fun. So you jump in there, or feel free to use the questions tab on your control panel. However you want to engage with us today, we want to encourage you to engage. We really want you to be a part of the conversation in this virtual world that we're living in. Okay, let's get to it. Today, we are talking to our standards experts about autonomous vehicles. So this is more than just an exciting concept. It is an emerging technology being developed by many companies, and one that is quickly being transformed from design into reality. Today, we have the opportunity to hear about the development of standards for this complex system, about the constraints, the challenges, and opportunities that are faced by standards engineers and technical panels when developing standards for autonomous vehicles and even other emerging technologies. It is my pleasure to introduce you to our two presenters today. Deb Prince is the Standards Program Manager and Chair of Underwriters Laboratories Internet of Things suite of standards. There's lots to ask questions about even just there. And this includes autonomous systems for automotive vehicles, trucks, unmanned aircraft systems, robotics, cybersecurity, augmented reality, and virtual reality, as well as other emerging areas. Heather Sacalario is the project manager in the standards division at Underwriters Laboratories. She manages the standards development process for a variety of standards technical panels, or as we call them, STPs. These panels consist of volunteer experts and serve as the consensus bodies that are responsible for developing and maintaining Underwriters Laboratories safety standards designed to mitigate risks and to the public and consumers, and lots to talk about there with STPs. So I am very excited for this conversation. Have been looking forward to this for quite some time, and I can't wait to get started. Deb, I'll turn it over to you.
All right, thank you, Kelly, and I appreciate it, and thank you everyone for your time today. Today I'm going to introduce, like Kelly said, the concept of autonomous vehicles, and specifically UL 4600, which is the standard of safety for the evaluation of autonomous products. Then I will turn it over to Heather, who will cover UL standards online tools, our standards development process, and upcoming related standards. Next slide, please. Since the publication of our first UL standard for safety in the year 1903, we have developed over 1,700 UL standards. But what drives standards development? Standards development is typically led by the private sector. Standards tend to be market driven. There is a new or a changing technology. There's some independent research. There's data in the field, or some overriding need to safeguard the public. In the case of UL 4600, it was proposed by the private sector. It is a new and rapidly changing technology, and autonomous vehicles are being tested in the field more and more every day. Ultimately, the need for a standard was proven, and UL Standards was able to bring together the variety of experts to develop the standard. Next slide. So what is UL 4600? The standard is for the evaluation of autonomous products, like I said. Those are self-driving cars, but the standard can be applied to other autonomous systems, such as a robot, a delivery bot, an autonomous truck. But at this point, most of the examples and the focus is on the vehicle, the autonomous vehicle. The other part of the standard is it's addressing the situation where there's no human in the loop. So it is fully autonomous. UL 4600 is unique in the fact that it is not prescriptive, but it provides a framework or a structure to build out a safety case, which I'll talk about a little bit in the coming slides. And I'd like to point out that UL 4600 is recognized as a US national standard. And for others in the standards world, it conforms to the WTO and the TBT principles. So next slide, please. When we talk about autonomous vehicles, what do you think of? You want to type out some thoughts here, then the hoots up. Oh, it's gonna produce a word cloud. I forgot. I was thinking just things were gonna pop immediately. So again, what do you think of autonomous vehicles? What's out there? What's on your mind? Getting some answers. Keep on. A few more minutes. All right. There we go. Self-driving cars, distractions, pedestrians, Tesla, chaos, safety concerns, responsibility, high tech, Jetsons. Oh, I like that. That's probably not so far in the future. Buses, trains. Oh, these are all great, great examples. Next slide. So I want to just step back and talk about a little bit, right side everyone, about the automation modes. So this slide here is from Dr. Philip Koopman of Carnegie Mellon, and it shows 4 modes to consider. The first one being the driver assistance. This is in a lot of your cars right now. It supports the human driver. So this could be your anti-lock brakes, your stability control, cruise control, adaptive cruise control, automatic emergency braking. Love that feature. So then the next one you talk about is supervised automation. So this is where the vehicle controls the speeds and the lane operations. The human driver monitors, fills those capacity gaps. So the driver, I like to say human all the time because again, autonomy, human. So the driver will be taking control, such as at a busy intersection, if there's complicated turns, lane changes, all of that. So the person doesn't always have to have their hands on the wheel, but they have to be able to take control in a set amount of time. Then you have the autonomous operation, which there is no human driver responsible for the safety. The vehicle is responsible for all aspects of driving and driving related safety. This is where UL 4600 is. And then a really important piece that's out there before we can have realistic autonomous vehicles on the road is this vehicle testing. So this is being done, regulated, wise with this trained safety driver that mitigates any dangerous behaviors. That might be performing, driving, taking over, things like that. And all this is logged, all that data is collected. and it is a robust system. So, next slide. So let's think about traditional cars. Drivers make thousands of tiny decisions based on experience. They know what a stop sign is. They know how to merge, that a child standing on a sidewalk might run into the street to chase a ball. It's also expected that a 40-year-old is a better driver than a 16-year-old, mainly due to that experience. They've had more hours behind the wheel, encountering more situations and learning from those situations. That experience allows the driver to apply that bank of knowledge to new situations. With autonomous vehicles, the human is removed, like I said, and the car must now possess that knowledge that the human has had along its history of driving. They have to know that the autonomous vehicle has to know the traffic laws and the conditions of operation. So how do you validate that an autonomous vehicle is safe? UL 4600 uses a safety case approach. The safety case is a structured explanation in the form of claims, supported by arguments and evidence that justifies that the vehicle is acceptably safe for a defined operational design domain. And it covers the item's life cycle. Next slide, please. Okay, so safety case. The safety case is a structured explanation in the form of claims supported by argument and evidence that justifies it's acceptably safe, like I said in the slide before. So a claim could be, the system avoids hitting pedestrians. The argument, or basically why this is true, is that your car can detect and maneuver to avoid or stop if you can't maneuver. So with that claim that your system avoids hitting pedestrians, and your evidence has to be test, analysis, simulations, the ways that you are supporting that claim and argument. So again, a structured explanation. Next slide, please. In addition, our standard has the criteria, and it falls into mandatory, required, highly recommended, or recommended. Mandatory requirements are just like they sound. You must comply. Required means you must do this unless it doesn't apply to your product. So an example could be LiDAR. If you don't use LiDAR in your vehicle, then you would just state that it doesn't apply and why it doesn't apply in your safety case. And then highly recommended and recommended are not requirements, but you should consider these to have a robust safety case. In addition, UL 4600 is unique in the fact that it provides prompts of, have you considered these examples and known pitfalls to consider while you're building the safety case? The standard's not prescriptive. It doesn't tell you specifically how to mitigate the risk, but it requires you to document how you've considered all the risk and how you will mitigate those risks. Next slide. Again, the manufacturer tells a story about everything they've considered, the environments of use, all the scenarios, all the judgments. This leads the designer through a thought process required to consider the possible complications that systems may encounter. It requires the evidence in the system is sufficiently robust to mitigate foreseeable hazards. Next slide. This is just a screenshot from the standard, and it shows you how many different sections. You have your safety case, you have risk assessments, you have sections talking about how the vehicle is actually going to interact with humans and other road users, such as like bicyclists, emergency vehicles, different things like that. You have software engineering, the dependability, you've got your verification and validation, maintenance life cycles. In addition, we have an annex that talks about how it works well and maps to some international standards in the ISO's arena. Next slide. Okay, another unique feature in this standard is that as manufacturers gain experience with UL 4600 and the products covered, there's a built-in recommendation that as new knowledge is gained, that it be proposed back into the standard, whether it means expanding your pitfalls, expanding the use cases, moving an item that's from recommended to highly recommended, or even required or mandatory. And sharing that knowledge will help move the level of safety on all autonomous products. Standards must be nimble and flexible as technology evolves. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Heather.
Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thank you so much for joining us. If you could switch to the next slide, I think we have a poll question. Have you ever ridden in an autonomous vehicle? We're going to give you a few seconds to answer here if you've ever ridden in one. Who's had the experience of actually riding in an autonomous vehicle? There are some out there on the roads testing and different capabilities. 13, okay. That's great. Okay, next slide. I'm going to talk a little bit about the standards development process that we use at UL and the one that we used to develop UL 4600. UL standards development process is done in phases, and all correspondence and voting are processed online using UL's collaborative standards development system so that anyone can participate. It's available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, online, anywhere there's internet access. And a typical standards project would go something like this. There's an optional preliminary review phase that is intended to get initial feedback on a proposed change to an existing standard or a brand new standard. And with a proposed standard, this phase could even occur more than once to gather the necessary feedback to continue. Then we do our more formal proposal review, or what we call the ballot phase. This is when the proposed new standard or proposed change to a standard goes out for balloting to the STP and commenting from all the stakeholders. Consensus is achieved if approval is received by a majority of the STP returning their votes and 2/3 of those returned votes being affirmative. So a key part of our process is that all of the comments we receive during the development process, all of the comments must be considered and responses are required to be given. And we have to sort of resolve all of the comments in order to move a standard through the phases of the project. And then we might have what we call a recirculation phase. So comments, responses, and any proposed changes that result from those comments could be sent out again, and the STP members would then have a chance to change their vote in light of the comments and responses if they were so persuasive. So then through all those phases, if consensus is still maintained, the changes would be published into final requirements of the standard. Next slide, please. Here's an example of the balanced standards technical panel for 4600 when the first edition was published in April of 2020. It illustrates the variety of participants across all of our interest categories, as well as the countries and regions that participated in the standards development process. This really shows the collaborative nature of our development process that we use for all consensus standards development, for which, for standards that we pursue approval by the American National Standards Institute in the US and/or Standards Council of Canada. UL strives to have no single interest category greater than 1/3 of the makeup of the panel. This is a goal that we try to aspire to, and it's not like a hard and fast rule, but we do try to aim for that, having no category make up more than 1/3. And we don't have to have a person in each category there could be some products or standards for which there are no, there's no interest in one particular category. For example, maybe UL 508, it's a standard for industrial control panels, something like that wouldn't have consumer participants, for example. And I think it's important to note that our procedures are approved by the Standards Council of Canada and the American National Standards Institute, and we are routinely audited by ANSI and SCC. Next slide, please. Developing standards is important, but in order for those standards to be effective, they need to be accepted in the marketplace. UL 4600 has been recognized as a leading standard in the area of autonomous vehicles. It's referenced by the U.S. National Highway Traffic Safety Administration's proposed framework for automated driving, the World Economic Forum's Safe Driving Initiative, and the U.S. Department of Transportation has also proposed this set of standards in an advance notice of proposed rulemaking. This illustrates the fact that UL 4600 is part of a larger global discussion on autonomy. Next slide, please. Next slide. Here's a diagram of the UL 4600 development timeline. It shows how quickly our process can work while maintaining that open consensus concept. We traveled around the world educating and collecting input during the development of UL 4600. Next slide. Once the standard is published, it's under what we call continuous maintenance, which means it's not, that's not the end of the changes to the standard. We published the first edition and we immediately kicked off some task groups to develop and propose new requirements to incorporate additional changes and propose new requirements that resulted in the lessons learned in the early use of the standard. So we are now in the final stages of that second round of standards development, and we are getting ready to publish the second edition of UL 4600 later this month. Next slide, please. In addition to 4600, UL is also developing other standards within the autonomous systems and technology area using these safety case principles that Deb explained. We are also going to be introducing autonomous trucking requirements into UL 4600 later this year, hopefully second quarter of this year. And then we also have a couple other standards in the early development stages. We have UL 4601, that's the standard for safety for the evaluation of autonomous unmanned aerial system, commonly known as drones. And this is an area of more regulatory requirements, and this standard is intended to work within the regulatory compliance framework, and that is with a drafting committee now. The UL 4600 standard will cover LiDAR and LiDAR systems. LiDAR is the light stands for light radar. And again, the approach is to address safety requirements without prescribing the required technology. A drafting committee is developing the first draft of this standard as well, so more to come. Next slide, please. So this slide just contains some links to some more information if you're interested in the standards development process. It has my contact information as well as Deb's. And I did want to point out that, students can participate in the standards development process as stakeholders. So if anyone's interested in getting some more information about standards or participating in the process, be sure to let us know. Next slide. Time for another poll question. Have any of you seen autonomous vehicles being tested out on the roads where you live? I know that I was in San Francisco a few years ago and I saw one out on the road, and there are different areas, depending on where you live, there are different areas that are known as, testing areas. So let's see. Oh, it's pretty split. Yeah, 4 people have, 5 people haven't, and 4 people aren't sure. They might not have noticed that they just drove by a an autonomous vehicle being tested. Next slide. Thank you. Thanks for paying attention, and we'll now open it up for a question and answer session. Kelly, I think back to you.
All right, fantastic. So I do have some questions. If you've tuned in with us before, you know I always have some questions, and I'm sure you all do too. So please use the questions box in your control panel to type those in, and we'll be sure to use those to drive our discussion. So first of all, fascinating. I think the emerging technology space is so interesting, and also just seems rapidly, exponentially, like speed of light kind of growth. So I just think there's so much to dig into there. But first, just recognizing who our audience is and thinking about how you came to do this work. What was your career path? I think one of the biggest trends we've seen in our presenters in this series is that they're very rarely a straight line from interest in initial studies to what the work you're doing today. So just very curious to hear how you came into this work.
Sure, I'll start. Yeah, so definitely a circuitous path to standards development. I think I had maybe 4 different careers before I landed there, but I have been in standards for, I think this is my 27th year. So obviously I liked it once I found my passion, right? I'm educated as a mechanical engineer and went the traditional heating, ventilation, and air conditioning first. And then I was a defense contractor and worked on helicopters of all things. And then I went to a state agency and worked in air quality. And from there, I came to UL. But the common thread that if I looked at what I enjoyed of these jobs was the tech writing and you know, looking at a problem and then being able to document that. So to me, it really was, if you look backwards, maybe not going forward, I saw it, but looking backwards, it seemed like I landed where I belonged because I enjoyed that piece of the pulling technology into words that can be used by others. Heather?
So my path to standards was interesting because I have 2 bachelor's degrees. One is in business, finance, and marketing, and then I graduated and didn't like any of my options, and I immediately went back to school for civil engineering. My family was involved in construction, and I have a sister who's an engineer, and I don't know, it just kind of made sense. And I feel like maybe I didn't choose correctly the first time, or I didn't, you know, I went to a liberal arts school, so it didn't have engineering, so it wasn't something I landed on. So I did go back again and get a second degree. I think it's interesting because I think people think that they pick a career and stick to it, you know, for the next 40 years, and that's not, you know, necessarily how it works. So when I got out of school as a civil engineer, I worked as a cost and scheduling engineer, and you know, in environmental construction, and I liked it, but it was very grueling and it wasn't very rewarding. And then a neighbor of mine introduced me to UL, and I just fell in love with the not-for-profit aspect of it, the public safety mission. And I was really impressed when I interviewed at UL. I think I interviewed with like 4 people, and no one had been there for less than 20 years. And the company I was with, no one had been there for more than 5 years. So that really impressed me with the company that, you know, one person I interviewed with had been there for 40 years. So, you know, back to my statement about you don't pick your career and stick with it for 40 years. Well, you know, this is something that if it's right for you, you know, you might end up. I'm starting this is my 25th year too, just like Deb's in her 27th. You know, it's very satisfying work.
It's amazing. I mean, I think when I think about standards, I think that standards are solutions, right? That it's the way that our organization gets to engineer solutions to major safety concerns and issues in the world. And I think you both just spoke really beautifully to that in your career path. And it's also wonderful to see people who are passionate about their work get to do that work. So, and I think in standards, especially because standards, there is so much passion there, and bringing that forward, I think, is really important. Okay, great. So there's lots of questions coming in, and some of them are about, you know, how to get engaged in a career in standards. We heard about your backgrounds. What are some other, you know, college track or majors or degrees that may lend themselves readily to the work that you're doing? We heard engineering and business. We know there's more. And then the follow-up to that would be for people who are in their career. We have somebody from Nigeria who's here with us that wants to get involved in this kind of work. Like, what are the recommendations there?
You want to start, Heather?
I would say, yeah, for the first part, for in terms of college majors and things, I mean, especially in standards, I mean, my background is in civil engineering, but I mean, there's not a lot of civil engineering in autonomous vehicles, or, you know, a lot of the tech things that I am working with. But so there's a wide variety in terms of, you know, the backgrounds that we have in our standards department. I think the STEM disciplines are, you know, always a great way to go in terms of, you know, especially, you know, in other parts of UL as well. You know, all of the technology areas are a good way to go. And then Deb, do you want to take the second part?
Yeah, I was just going to add, though, we've got several English majors and standards, and on our international team, we have a former teacher, we have an art history major, right? If you find a passion, and you find, as long as you keep building your skill sets, I think you can get there for sure. All right, so the second part is how do you get engaged with us? So I think Heather had pointed out, if you wanted to be engaged in even seeing how a committee works, right? You can contact us, and we can put you on a stakeholder list, and you can follow the updates of a standard. You can attend a meeting, you know, you're in Nigeria, you can attend a meeting, you know, virtually, call in. There are not restrictions. If you want to come to one of my UL 4600 meetings, you know, we'll give you the call-in information. You can see how the committees work, and the dynamics, and the different voices and perspectives that are brought to the table. I mean, Heather pointed out that we use consensus bodies, and not everyone, I mean, there has to be a knowledge and a passion for the product that the standard covers, but you don't have to be a designer. I mean, we have consumer advocates, right? So they're bringing a voice to the table. You have somebody in regulatory, they're bringing a voice to the table that isn't how you design it or test to it. They want to see that the safety needs are met. So I welcome any and all to come sit in on a meeting and see how we work, and see if that's an interest to you.
Yeah, you know, it brings up another point in thinking about the global nature of a standard, especially around autonomous vehicles. And just thinking, so I'm in Denver. We just had a good blizzard that impacted our roads in a major way. And now I'm thinking about just the different regions and climates in the world. How do we create, or how do you create the standards so that they can be adaptable to those different driving conditions, recognizing that there's a million other variables in this space?
Absolutely, I can take that, Heather, if you want. So I mentioned the operation design domain. So that's the joy of 4600, is that it's not prescriptive, right? So if a manufacturer says, my car will never be used or sold in an environment that has snow, their part of their testing and part of their safety case argument does not have to address snow.
Okay.
So it's up to the manufacturer. Now, if you are going to be in, you know, Colorado, and that vehicle is going to be used in that space, then it has to be, how you're going to mitigate. That's a risk, right? That's a risk that has to be in your safety case, and you have the manufacturer or the designer of that has to say how they'll mitigate that. And when you're looking at robo-taxis, it might even be different if it's your self-driving car versus a robo-taxi. That robo-taxi could get dumped on with snow before they're called to pick up the next person, and how the windshield's going to be clean. How do you know it's safe enough to be out there and all of that? So really, those are, when you talk about knowns, the known knowns and unknown unknowns, right? And pitfalls and things to consider. All of that kind of stuff is actually built into the standard. Very good question.
It's fascinating. It speaks to this too when you said they're already on the road, and Heather, when you asked, have we ridden in one and have we seen one? Where is the handoff between meeting the required and mandatory standards and having these out on the road to be further tested? What are the thresholds for taking an autonomous vehicle or a robo-taxi or an autonomous truck, knowing that it's not our role to regulate these things, but I'm wondering where that handoff happens so that manufacturers feel like they've met the safety requirements enough to put them out into traffic.
Boy, that's a loaded question. I can try to stab if you want, Heather, again. So there are, each state and local jurisdictions do have requirements around the testing when it's in a testing mode, right? The gray area would be when you have a vehicle that has some autonomous features.
Mm-hmm.
That's not fully autonomous. Even if you watch some of the commercials that show some of these autonomous features, they're showing the hands on the wheel, right? The intention of the vehicles that are on the road today is there's hands on the wheels, even though you have that different feature. So that next step's hard. Getting to the fully autonomous, that's a hard leap, and it's, you've got a lot of manufacturers that are testing it and proving it, and some of the concepts are by how many miles they've done without incidents. Some of them are simulations, some of them are a variety of different ways, but bringing it back to UL 4600, it gives them a structure to get there. Right? It gives them a structure to get there. They're not there right now, but it's a structure to get there. Most of these are in those training stages, and different levels of experience on that. Trucking is definitely moving ahead, potentially at a faster pace, just because of things that happened with the pandemic and workers issues and a variety of things like that. So. Yeah, that's an interesting question and a challenge. But again, the standard gives you a framework to get to that fully autonomous level.
Yeah, I think it's really helpful, and it clarifies the role of standards in many contexts, right? So I appreciate that very much. I want to turn to the STP, specifically around 4600. I know that there is, we have a group of stakeholders or representatives that are typically, that represent different interests in an STP. When it came to 4600, what were the specific interests and stakeholders around at the STP, and did those interests evolve over the time of development, and will they further evolve? Or I'm just wondering if you can speak to that a little bit more.
Want me to take it, Deb?
You can. I've been talking a lot.
Yeah, we have we had a initial outreach, and when we reached out to a lot of the the big OEMs and so that we could have a variety of interest in the producer what we call the producer category, which is, it's not as traditional for this type of a standard, but we had, different like tier 1 and full stack, and then supply chain, like sensor makers and all these different aspects of it. And then it's going to continue to evolve because we're about to introduce trucking. So we wanted to introduce some of the trucking sides of it and make sure that that's reflected in the overall panel. We're going to be combining. We had an existing STP for the trucking. We're going to be combining it into one as we're about to introduce the trucking requirements. So we want to make sure we have that good balance of interest, among the passenger vehicles and the trucking, and continue to make sure that we have the right cross mix of interests.
And then to add, I can add to that. So like Heather said, we have these buckets: producer and supply chain and commercial industrial user. And with an autonomous system, which isn't the car, it's the autonomy. So you have to define autonomy as your producer. So we did make a consistent strategic approach on who fell into which of these buckets and have it out there. And we reference it quite frequently when we're adding somebody new. But on top of that, I'd like to add that we also looked at globally, like we wanted to look at, make sure that this was well represented around the world. And because if I'm driving a vehicle in Michigan, who's to say I'm not driving it in Canada, or Europe is cross countries, and Asia has a lot of autonomy initiatives going on. And so we really made a conscious decision to make sure we have all those voices, either on the committee or as a larger stakeholder group, so that we do have a more national or internationally usable standard. Because we know vehicles aren't in one location, like you said.
Yeah, I mean, I just keep coming back to the variables of conditions around any vehicle and what that conversation must entail.
That's where the feedback loop comes into play too. It's going to be so critical as things are learned and more experiences are gained. Then we can put those requirements, and additional examples and things back into 4600.
Even the handoff from phone systems, right? They're obviously having, and so there's redundancies that have to be in there built in. So like your redundancy can't just be that I switch to the next tower. Well, if your carrier goes down, that next tower is still your carrier. So they've got to even look at those kind of redundancies, because again, these aren't, in the future, if there's no human in the loop, there may be no steering wheel even.
Yeah, somebody said Jetsons earlier and said, what do you think of? And that's exactly what came to mind for me, was the Jetsons that felt a million miles away when I was younger. Heather, I think it's an interesting point that you raised around, getting feedback. If I think about the little I know about the automotive industry, and I just see different commercials for different brands, right? I'm wondering if this is competitive and to get this technology developed, and if so, does that prohibit or inhibit the feedback that you all receive around the testing that's happening on the road?
Well, it's all voluntary. So, I think it's interesting over the development of the standard. We've seen it kind of shift from, maybe some resistance in the early days to, it seems like everyone's kind of coming around, and now that the U.S. government has recognized UL 4600 in some aspects, then it's kind of helped to open up the different participants' eyes, and this is what's coming, and we're going to need some regulation. So I think that has helped us along the way.
And the fact that it's not prescriptive, so they're not jockeying around my technology's proprietary or better than yours, and I want to get this into the standard, right? They have to just argue their own technology. So I think that leads it to a little bit more cooperative, and knowing this is a high risk area, right? What we even have insurance company on the STP, right? How do you insure this? Yeah, there's so many follow-up dialogues that can happen on this, because is the car manufacturer at fault? Is, you know, who insures an autonomous vehicle? Who's driving it, right? So
Yeah.
these are some interesting conversations for sure.
Well, it's interesting that that was actually a question posed from the audience today, is that, you know, is around the ultimate liability for accidents involving autonomous vehicles, and you know, what happens there. So it's interesting that I love hearing that the insurance industry is at the table and thinking about
They
this.
are at the table, and you know, and I'm sure some of our stakeholders are litigators, right? I'm sure, and that's a big unknown, right? It is definitely a to be determined.
Yeah, yeah. So there is a question about the work with the Society of Automotive Engineers
Mhm.
that's happening, and it's about, you know, joint standards. I think it's a good example. You know, will future versions of this of 4600 be issued as a joint standard? What does that look like from a standards perspective? I was also thinking about you know, drone technology. I have somebody in my family who works on regulating drones from an aviation perspective. There seem to be some crossovers there between what they're looking for and what they standardize as safe from the aviation perspective in this. So I'm just wondering if you could speak to that a little bit.
Okay, so the SAE one's easy. We do have a memorandum of understanding with them, a signed one that we signed. Gosh, it's been maybe it's COVID, so it could have been a month ago, but I think it was a little, I think it was about 2 years ago we signed it, so that we can look at ways to not duplicate in the space and coordinate wherever possible. Are we looking at a co-published standard? Not at this time. However, they are liaisons and sit on our committee, and we are on their committee. So we're on their on-road
Automated driving.
Yes, a driving committee. You would think I would know since I'm the one sitting there. And we're on their autonomous trucking, or their trucking and bus standards. So we are looking at coordinating, using some of the same resources of people, and making sure that both of our committees are open and available to comment on and participate in our activities. So that would be the first question answered. The second one, we're in the drafting stage. So autonomy and drones are going to look different, like Heather stated in her piece, because it is, you know, there's the FAA space, there's different sizes, there's different use cases, the military's involved, NASA's involved, FAA's involved. We have a really strong drafting committee that's well versed in that space, that's looking at the best way to address the gaps in autonomy. And so those gaps can be used in the regulatory framework, because again, in the air is much more regulatory driven. In addition, looking at, are these Jetson type where there's people in them, or are they more packages and other drops, right? So we've been in discussions with, you know, manufacturers who are more Jetson type. We're talking to, you know, your big delivery guys, UPS and FedEx, that they're looking at final mile. So you might have your autonomous truck goes all the way to this depot area, and then your autonomous drones will take those packages and drop them off in the porches, right? I mean, or your little delivery bots will go around, and there's so many options, but the common thread again is this autonomy piece, the software within there, and that setting a framework around that you can measure it and claim why you're safe and show why the company believes they're safe in that, and that they've considered everything, is really our goal in our standards development. Add anything to that, Heather?
No, I think you covered it very well.
What, when you think about the rapid pace of emerging technology, how do standards keep up? Because it seems to me the consensus model is very intentional and required and necessarily takes time and input. And I think about that next to, Jetson type drones with people in them as a possibility. How do you all think about that? How to rectify the time it takes for standards to safely engineer systems and the rapid technological advances.
Consistent challenge, right? It is.
Yeah.
It's definitely a challenge. I think the fact that typically the players that are making this stuff are trying to sit at the table, so they see where the standard's going, right? So they have this heads up and input, and they're wanting to do the right thing. So I think that helps. But knowing, like Heather pointed out, we go in continuous maintenance. So, we had a second edition that's going to be published soon, and we immediately got the next set of proposals that are going to go out there. And it's that balance, because as a manufacturer, you need to know which standard you're applying, because at some point you've got to finish your design and go, right? So you can't change the standard every 3 months and meet to that also. So I think there's just that balance, but I think being at the table and knowing those discussions is what's key. Sure.
Yeah, I would just add that a proposal request to revise a standard can be accepted at any time as well. So even if we're not on a set revision cycle, so it is a cycle. Just the process, the standards development process is its own cycle, but it's not set. So that if we got a proposal request to revise the standard tomorrow, we could incorporate that into the next round. We can also have multiple rounds of revisions or proposals happening at the same time. So, depending on, not only for UL 4600, but other rapidly changing technology, areas for standards, we can have multiple proposals ongoing, and then those revisions can roll out, as they complete the process. So it's not just a set time, like every 2 years you make proposals. It's not like that. This is more open.
Yeah, and I know you talked about the flexibility and adaptability and nimbleness of this process too, and I think that's important to restate, based on what you just said.
Absolutely, and with any standard, and not only in this space, but in any of UL standards, if there is a safety critical need, that not typically, it gets put in, right? It doesn't get dragged down, and it can be done incredibly quickly and still be consensus, because it's a true safety critical need. And people aren't going to fight that. It's not going to be drug out. It's, resting. And that does happen quite quickly.
Yeah, it's amazing. So my last question for you both is just to ask you, we come from the education side of things, and it seems to me that for people to trust autonomous vehicles, there needs to be some sort of awareness or education for this. If you could design any sort of educational messaging, or if you just could say one thing about the process for people to feel, you know, like where do people find trust in autonomous vehicles on their roads?
I would say testing is the key. That's the overall, you know, there were the 5 levels of autonomy introduced by SAE early on, and those are kind of being replaced by the diagram from Dr. Koopman that Deb shared, that it's really it's going to come down to testing. You know, can you fall asleep in an autonomous vehicle? You know, that's going to be the main thing.
Great. Agree. She hit it. Testing is really where that trust is going to be built, right? And if there are vehicles on the road that have not been adequately tested, they're going to be the, you know, poor players, and it could damage the whole ecosystem. So I think that you know, that's why everyone is agreeing to testing, and they're being so cautious in this space, because it's you know, it's high stakes. Yes, so interesting. Well, as usual, I could spend the rest of the day with you both and asking all of the questions. And I would like to just honor everybody's time. For everybody, you know, we talk about the idea that standards create a world that's engineered to keep us safe. And I think this conversation has really illuminated that in really wonderful ways. You know, when we look around us and we look on our roads, and we think about the standards process that gets us to be able to move around in our world in a safe way. I appreciate how you both spoke to that through this new, wonderful, and very interesting technology. It's awesome. So thank you both for the work that you do, and thank you very much for your time today. And
Thank you so much for having us.
Yes, thank you for having us. Enjoyed it.
Awesome. All right. So for everybody in our audience, coming up on March 31st, we are going to be speaking with our international colleagues from the Standards Organization. And so we'll have an evening presentation for us, an early morning presentation for them coming from Singapore, India, and China. And we'll be talking about, you know, how the need for safety is universal, and how it differs among different countries, different geographies with different codes and installment practices. Some of this we spoke to today, different materials in use and different trainings and practices. And so when developing safety standards for international application, we must consider the differing needs of these geographies, as well as differences in climate and culture. So we hope that you'll join us on March 31st at 8 p.m. Eastern. Grab a cup of tea and join us for a wonderful conversation. Just put the link to register for that in the chat if you're not there already. And as a final note today, you will be receiving a survey about today's webinar. I'm pleased to say that we'll be continuing this series into next academic year, and we read everything that you write to us and listen to your comments as feedback for us to adjust our series. And so please take a couple minutes of your valuable time for that as well. All right, want to say thank you again to everybody. Have a wonderful Tuesday, and we'll talk soon.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks.